5 systems spinning around in the Atlantic all at once. It's definitely got to catch your eye when you see that in the news.
Yeah, no kidding. 5 systems at once does sound a little intense, I get it. But hey, that's what we're here for. We'll break it all down for you. And actually, while it might seem like a lot, having 5 systems going on isn't that out of the ordinary for this time of year, especially in the Atlantic.
Okay, so let's dive right in. We're tackling hurricane forecasting today using this USA Today article as our guide. We want to make sure you walk away knowing exactly what's happening out there and why it matters.
Couldn't agree more. And one of the things this USA Today article points out is this area in the Caribbean that's popped up on the National Hurricane Center's radar.
Right, and they're calling it, what is it, a broad area of low pressure with like a 40% chance of becoming a tropical depression. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Sure thing. So picture the atmosphere like a basketball, right?
Yeah.
A broad area of low pressure is kind of like if you let a little bit of air out of that basketball. Creates a weaker spot where air wants to rush in. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to turn into a hurricane right away, but it's definitely like the first ingredient. Kind of like, say you've got a 40% chance of winning a raffle, you might win, you might not, but it's worth paying attention to.
Okay, that makes sense. So then a tropical depression is like the first step on the road to becoming a hurricane.
Exactly. It basically means the system is starting to get organized. Winds are picking up to at least 38 miles per hour, about what you'd drive on a city street. Not a hurricane yet, but definitely a sign that things are starting to brew.
And speaking of brewing, the USA Today article mentioned that Florida might be in the path of this potential storm. What's the latest on that?
So right now, AccuWeather is suggesting that Florida could see the most rain if this thing actually develops. And it makes sense. Florida's position, kind of jutting out there in the southeast U.S. and bordering the Atlantic, makes it a pretty prime target for hurricanes, you know. But, and this is a big but, it's super important to remember that it's still way too early for forecasts to be accurate this far out.
So a lot of ifs at this point, which actually reminds me, the article mentioned something about this system's timeline actually slowing down, which seems kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it? Can you explain what's going on there?
Yeah, that's where the really interesting science comes in. See, there's a bunch of factors that can affect how a hurricane develops, one of the big ones being wind shear.
Wind shear, okay.
So imagine, right, you're trying to build a tower of blocks, but somebody keeps shaking the table. That's kind of what wind shear does. It disrupts the structure of a hurricane as it's trying to form.
Okay, I get you. So wind shear can actually weaken a developing storm or even mess with its projected path.
Exactly. And that's where things get tricky for forecasters, you know? They use these incredibly complex computer models, the GFS from the US, the European model, to try and predict these things, but sometimes the models don't agree, which makes things even more complicated.
It's like having 2 GPSs in your car, and they're both telling you different ways to go.
That's a great way to put it. So yeah, even with all the fancy technology, there's still a bit of a guessing game involved in predicting hurricanes, especially this far out. We've gotten a lot better at forecasting their paths, that's for sure, but intensity and speed, those are still pretty tricky to get exactly right.
So it's really about understanding probabilities and preparing for different outcomes.
You got it. And it's also about not getting too fixated on just one system, which is easy to do when one is potentially menacing Florida. We've got 4 other systems out there.
Oh, right. We can't forget about those. What's the deal with those other 4? Should we be worried?
Right. So zooming out a bit, 2 of those systems are way out in the Atlantic, and they're both expected to curve away from land. So not too much to worry about there. But the other 2 are worth keeping an eye on, just in case. One's hanging out near Bermuda, and the other's off the coast of Africa. They both have a lower chance of actually developing into anything serious, but it's a good reminder that we're still in hurricane season, folks, and it's not over till it's over.
So much for a quiet Atlantic, right? This has been a really interesting deep dive, I got to say. It really highlights how complicated hurricane forecasting really is and how important it is to stay informed, especially during this time of year.
Couldn't agree more. We might not be able to predict the future with 100% certainty, but understanding the science behind these storms and sticking with reliable sources like the National Hurricane Center is the best way to stay safe.
Absolutely. And on that note, here's something for everyone to think about. With all these systems popping up, it really makes you wonder about the long-term impacts of climate change on how strong these storms get and how often we see them. Definitely something to ponder, especially as we head into a future that seems to be getting more and more unpredictable.